I appreciate everybody joining us today for this. I talked with Dr. DeForest and Dr. DeCesare and said, after the events of January 6th, I said, I've been thinking a good bit recently about the connections between religion and nationalism. And I would like to talk about that. And so they were kind enough to give me this opportunity today. So, I've written a little bit about this as I've been doing some historical work, but I haven't written anything specifically about the issue of civil religion in America. And so this is a way for me to start drawing my thoughts together on that topic. And so I'm going to share this with you today. There's a lot of material here. I've built in places to stop and have discussions along the way. So we'll do that as we go. And you can let me know if you feel like I'm onto something or I'm missing something. So I'll appreciate your feedback as we go. So let me go ahead and share my screen and get started.
And as a side note, I'll be monitoring the chat. So if there's any questions that pop up in the chat, I can
Great.
I can do that as well.
All right. As I watched the Capitol insurrection unfold and as analyses of the events were published, I was not at all surprised to see many banners and signs bearing Christian symbols, to see and hear many white Christians preaching, singing, praying among the people who marched from the ellipse to the Capitol, and to find Christians even among the insurrectionists who fought with police, invaded the Capitol, and spilled blood. Indeed, one group of insurrectionists, having smashed their way in, solemnly removed their hats and prayed earnestly in Jesus' name on the floor of the Senate. Shocking? Yes. Surprising? Not at all for anyone who was paying attention. In the aftermath of the violence, many in the media called it a Christian insurrection. Predictably, some white evangelical Christians deflected responsibility by claiming that real Christians would never take part in such lawless violence, even as they doubled down on their support for Donald Trump and his policies. Only a few were sufficiently chastened to call for a reckoning and a self-examination. In a roundabout sense, the deflectors were right, but not in the way they thought they were right. Many American citizens who are Christians, Jews, Muslims, are also communicants in another religion, one that doesn't have a federal tax exemption or any official clergy or an official organized structure. Yet it does have a religious discourse, a set of practices, a community that subscribes to its discourse and engages in its practices. It even has an informal set of institutions that regulate the discourse, the practices, and the community. Of course, I'm talking about American civil religion, which sociologist Robert N. Bellah described as an elaborate and well-institutionalized religion that exists alongside of and rather clearly differentiated from the churches. And I would add, from the mosques, the synagogues, and other worshiping communities. So I want to discuss the varieties of civil religion that are competing for dominance in our society and show why race and religion are important intersecting forces in the struggle to define the shape of American nationalism. Civil religion is a specialized type of religion. I think of it as the emergent religion of modernity, or perhaps the new religious movement of the age of nationalism. I call it religion repurposed. Civil religion is nationalism sacralized. It often intertwines with older religions in a way that makes it difficult to tell them apart. But it is possible to differentiate between them by keeping the object of reverence carefully in focus. While the older religions focus on God or the gods or the spirit world or even the human spirit as objects of reverence, civil religion is focused on reverence for the nation. Civil religion appropriates the most powerful techniques of religion for identity formation. Specifically, I'm thinking of myth making and ritual, although there are others. And it borrows ideas and symbols from the older religions and reinterprets them. In civil religion, these powerful tools invest the idea of the nation with sacred significance, so that those who share in the national identity will be profoundly devoted to the cause of the nation. It just so happens that the dominant religion at the time of the United States founding was Protestant Christianity. So many streams of American civil religion borrow heavily from the Bible and the Christian tradition. But unlike Christianity, civil religion does not point the believer to a heavenly world beyond this world. Instead, all forms of civil religion are focused on constructing a this worldly identity for the American people based on certain selected values. And those ideas, when made sacred, create a space for people to construct a common sense of national identity and a shared national morality. Of course, the role of religion in legitimating social structure is nothing new. It is one of the earliest insights arising from the sociology of religion. Emile Durkheim claimed a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Now, if one removes the bit about the church, this is a very useful definition. Durkheim claimed that religion exists to serve the needs of the social structure to which it is connected. Indeed, he understood the object of religious devotion as society itself. Religion legitimates social structure and strengthens social solidarity, according to Durkheim, by identifying a category of sacred things which embody and represent the most important values of the society. And by setting them apart as sacred, by making them untouchable and placing them beyond question, they are rendered transcendent and timeless, and belief in these sacred things unites the individuals of that society into one single moral community. It does not matter what the value happens to be. Notions of race or caste, hierarchy or patriarchy can be sacralized just as easily as notions of equality. But whatever the value, enshrining them in myth and solemn ritual is a very powerful way to get individuals to internalize them, thereby reinforcing social structure and social solidarity. It is the sociological equivalent of putting fluoride in the water supply. Everybody who drinks the water gets more than just the water, but most people aren't even aware it's happening. All right, so let me stop for a second and see if there are questions or comments. Okay, hearing none, I will continue on. So religion is always profoundly connected to social structure. What makes civil religion new is that it is the religion of a particular kind of social structure. Civil religion is the religion about nations in the age of nationalism, and nations haven't been around all that long. It's important to note that all European constructions of nationalism take white supremacy for granted. So when I make a distinction later on about civic and ethnic types of nationalism, it's not a question of whether racist ideology is or isn't part of the identity construction. Historically speaking, it was in every single case. The question is whether the presence of racist ideology presents an internal contradiction for the type. There is no contradiction between racist ideology and ethnic nationalism, while racist ideology presents a profound internal contradiction for civic nationalism. As an identity, nationalism assumes that the individual is a member of the people, and the people is the body of the nation. There are different understandings of the people, but all nationalisms depend upon the people as an organizing principle. For any type of nationalism, the people is the entity that bears sovereignty, the central object of loyalty, and the basis of collective solidarity. Membership in the people is the basis of community in the nation. Theoretically, the individuals who compose the people are fundamentally homogeneous in one way or another. Civic nationalism means that being a part of the people is equal to and identical with citizenship. Nationality is in principle open and voluntary. It can be acquired by those who were not formally part of the nation. In principle, one can change nationality by changing one's citizenship. All citizens are equally members of the people. Other distinctions are theoretically irrelevant. Ethnic nationalism, on the other hand, is inherent with one's identity as a member of an ethnic group. It is involuntary in the sense that one's group identity is a matter of birth. Consequently, one's nationality is fixed and immutable. In ethnic nationalism, all are equal who share the ethnic identity. In some cases, as in the modern state of Israel, a type of second-class citizenship may be possible for others, Palestinian Christians, for example. Let me immediately qualify the typology that I've just set up by saying that, I've described the logical types, but historically contingent reality doesn't always conform to the logic. So white supremacy is much older than all forms of nationalism. And given the need in nascent American nation for a justification of slavery and the displacement of indigenous population, white supremacy constituted a boundary condition in the formation of every type of American nationalism. Thus, civic nationalism emerged in the United States riddled with internal contradictions, and those contradictions have been exposed by friendly critics of the national project who believe civic nationalism and wanted to resolve the contradictions. And they've also been exploited by ethnic nationalists bent on indicting the national project as cynically hypocritical and oppressive. Likewise, it's not unusual to hear ethnic nationalists, especially white nationalists, who use the language of civic nationalism, but always with the caveat, spoken or unspoken, that when they speak of the nation, they mean to include only the folks who fit the profile. Okay, again, I'll stop for a minute and see if anybody has a question or a comment before I move on.
Oh, yeah, I had a quick question. Thank you so far for this presentation. It's really great. What I am curious about is this idea that white supremacy is older than nationalism. So when you say that, like, are you talking about American nationalisms specifically, or nationalism as a broad concept? Like, what precisely are you talking about in there? Okay.
I mean both. I locate the emergence of nationalism in England in the 16th century. And I locate the emergence of white supremacy as far back as the mid 13th century.
Okay.
Dr. DeForest had his hand raised, so.
Okay, let me
Hi.
Hi.
Just a quick observation really is I find it interesting that the way the two different distinctions you've got here blend, both in terms of we have in America civic nationalism, but it's because of the impacts of white supremacy. There's an ethnic nationalism in the undercurrent, whereas in the Republic of Ireland currently, you've got an interesting tension simultaneously existing between the two, where there's a civic nationalism, the Irish Republican tradition, but the ethnic nationalism, where there was a sense of what Irishness is as an ethnic identity, one that's currently being challenged a great deal with a lot of emigration now. So it's a really fascinating distinction you're drawing and teasing out here.
Thank you, Dr. DeForest. And I'm going to make the argument that both of these have been in competition through the whole history of the American nation. So that's where I'm headed. All right. So is there anything else, or should I continue on? Okay, I'll continue on. So as you may have inferred by now, different varieties of nationalism generate correspondingly different varieties of civil religion. The tradition that Philip Gorski calls civic republicanism, and I couldn't think of a better name than civic republicanism, so I'm using his name, it emerged with civic nationalism and draws its symbolic content primarily from the prophetic biblical tradition's demand for justice and the New Testament's focus on redemption and sacrifice. White Christian nationalism, on the other hand, is a specific type of ethnic nationalism that draws its symbolic content much more heavily from the biblical conquest narrative and apocalypticism. But it's important to remember that one cannot set hard and fast rules. Religious discourse is multivalent. Context is everything. Oh, I should have advanced to this screen before. So I'll give you a second to look at this screen. I forgot to advance to this screen. So here's the civic Republican tradition that goes with civic nationalism. Here's the white Christian nationalist tradition that goes with ethnic nationalism. All right. So there are many varieties of white Christian nationalism. More extreme versions include the Ku Klux Klan, the Christian Identity Movement, some of the American Patriots or Christian nationalists, and others. I would also include the American Legion, at least historically, as a type of white Christian nationalism. As Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry note in their recent book on Christian nationalism, Christian nationalists tend to blur and conflate Christian religious identity with white identity, natural-born U.S. citizenship, and right-of-center politics. There are also many varieties of Black nationalism, mostly rooted in one way or another in the political philosophy of Marcus Garvey. Interestingly, Garvey himself often employed Christian ideas and references in his Black nationalist perspective. Those who followed him took his Black nationalist political philosophy, rejected the Christianity, and connected the politics to a different source of religious perspective. Examples include the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, for example. The original Black Panther Party was a notable secular exception to the rule, as it combined Black nationalism with Marxist and Maoist social political analysis. But some of the recent movements that I've looked at that are going under the Black Panther rubric are now using religious rhetoric. Of course, they're not connected to the original movement, but they're using the same image. There is also the American Indian movement that was most active in the late 1960s and 70s, which combined an ethnic nationalist political agenda with Native American spirituality. All right, so I'll pause for questions about that for just a second. Okay, so now let me turn to the civic republican tradition of civil religion. In 1922, G.K. Chesterton published a book called What I Saw in America, in which he wrote, "America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice, that governments exist to give them that justice, and that their authority is for that reason just." Chesterton had stumbled upon civic republicanism and took it for and mistook it as the only civil religion in America. He argued that American identity is not primarily a matter of blood or soil. He saw it as a matter of faith, not in God, but in the ideals articulated in the Declaration of Independence: equality, liberty, and justice for all. Therefore, at least theoretically, he thought anyone might become part of the American nation through a sort of conversion experience by believing and trusting in the American creed. And that is where the American sociologist Robert Bellah comes into the picture. In 1966, Bellah proposed the thesis that American nationalism has always incorporated a religious dimension, setting apart certain national values as sacred and transcendent. He borrowed the term civil religion from Rousseau, but his theory is more dependent on Durkheim. According to Bellah, the transcendent values espoused in the civil religion create a moral standard, not just for societal self-celebration, as Durkheim's theory might suggest, but as a standard for critiquing the civic nationalist project in the United States. Bellah thought civil religion created a space where ordinary people could engage in ethical reflection and discourse about the meaning of the American nation. Bellah's original hypothesis was focused on what I'm calling the civic republican tradition. He thought the sacred values of the nation were freedom, equality, and justice, and that civil religion allowed people to examine the nation's commitment to those values. But as you may have already inferred, that is not the whole story, and Bellah's claims have been hotly debated. But before we get to that, let's take a closer look at the civic republican tradition. The founders borrowed heavily from the Bible and Christianity to construct this secular creed. I call it a secular creed because it is not focused on a world beyond, but on the civic and political life of the nation in this world. Now, although this image that's on the screen now was never approved by Congress, Benjamin Franklin's design for the Great Seal of the United States is a great example of this secular repurposing of biblical symbolism. It's a bit hard to make out on the screen, but America is symbolized by the ancient Israelites, God's elect, who defied Pharaoh's might, crossed the Red Sea, and followed God into the wilderness on the way to the Promised Land. Franklin supplemented the image with an unmistakably political motto: rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. The implication is obvious. The revolution was America's Red Sea crossing, and the nation is on a journey with God to a promised land of liberty. Beginning with George Washington, presidents have typically served as priests or priestly mediator types in the American creed. One of the best examples is Lincoln, who called for renewed devotion to the civic republican creed in his Gettysburg Address. He declared, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln characterized the Civil War as God's judgment on the nation because of slavery. God had decreed that, quote, every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, unquote. In his role as priest of the nation, Lincoln declared that the nation must be held to account. Most presidents have embraced biblical imagery and God language to some extent. Richard Nixon was the first president of the television age to use the phrase, God bless America, at the end of a speech. He used it in 1973 to conclude his first speech on the Watergate crisis. It has now become the standard closing line of presidential speeches. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama all went biblical when they borrowed Jesus' image of a city on a hill that cannot be hidden to describe America as a shining beacon of freedom and opportunity for the world. There have been many attempts from the margins to expand the civic Republican notion of the American creed. There is no better example than Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial at the end of the March on Washington, King challenged the nation to, quote, rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, unquote. King's civil rights speeches are filled with American sacred values, intertwined with biblical symbolism and the aesthetic of the Black church. In my judgment, King was the greatest expositor of the civic Republican tradition in the 20th century. Given his subsequent assassination, it is no surprise to me that he has been canonized as a martyr and saint of the nation, where he heads a very small group of African Americans, including, I think, Rosa Parks and John Lewis, who share his status as transcendent national figures. Interestingly, Malcolm X, as a representative of the Black nationalist position, was sharply critical of the civil Republican approach of King and the rest of the civil rights movement. In his 1963 message to the grassroots, and again in his 1964 speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, delivered only a short time after the March on Washington, Malcolm X mocked King and other civil rights leaders in the civic Republican tradition. He thought they were Uncle Toms, duped by the white man into calling for an equality that would never come. As an advocate of separation and Black self-sufficiency, Malcolm X believed integration served only to dilute and diminish the power of the Black people and delay the Black Revolution. Okay, that's a good place to stop for a question or comment. Would anybody like to talk?
Yeah, so far, thank you so much for this. I feel like I'm learning a lot and absorbing a lot. So I apologize also if I'm not kind of appropriately applying these concepts because I'm learning them kind of as I go. But
Sure.
one thing that I think I'm curious to hear your thoughts about in terms of the framework that you're presenting is like the formation of sort of the nationalist radical Black church that is, you know, even as far back as like, if we think about Nat Turner as a fundamentally religious figure, right, before being a revolutionary, or if we think about
Sure.
Denmark Vesey, and then later, of course, you've got figures like Jeremiah Wright, right, who Obama had to distance himself from in terms of the American creed, but nonetheless is very engaged in sort of or not a civic Christianity, but a Christianity nonetheless articulated through nationalism. So I was just curious about how those kinds of figures or formations fit into your argument.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one that I haven't really given a lot of consideration to yet. But as I said, you know, these, although we can create these logical types, you know, we have to look at actual historical manifestations as on a sliding scale, right? And so the actual individuals and actual movements are always going to be somewhere in between the extremes, right? And they might be right on the margin between both sides of the scale, right? So somebody like Jeremiah Wright, obviously, there's a strong influence of Black nationalist consciousness, right? But also is interested in engaging in sort of the civic nationalist claims about freedom, equality, and justice, right? For everybody. So so again, they're going to be, they're going to be at different locations on the scale, but we use the types so that we can identify different strands in the discourse, right? So when people are talking, when they're expressing ideas, we say, that's comes from this part of the tradition, that comes from that part of the tradition. And it won't always make logical sense, but it makes historically contingent sense, I think. Does that help at all?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's really interesting to me that there are these Christian examples that you can point to that are used in resistance to the majority tradition.
Yeah, and I think there's a broad tradition in Black liberation theology as well. And even if you think about hip hop, like a lot of times people think about hip hop in terms of its relationship to Islam, which is completely fair and accurate. But if you think about, I mean, Kanye West is a bad example now, but just in terms of the melding and authenticities and that kind of thing. But someone like Lecrae, who's a religious rapper who has made more secular music recently in protest, right? Somebody like Kendrick Lamar too, who takes like the Black Hebrew Israelite framework and then combines it with the Christian theology in protest as well, right? There's a lot of kind of hip hop is, very into blending different ideologies, but I think that it's interesting to think through in terms of these frameworks, the kind of through line that melds Christianity and nationalism in the Black tradition specifically.
Anybody?
I had a question about the description of Malcolm X's position on Martin Luther King, on Dr. King. I think that I would agree, but disagree. What I would disagree to a slight extent, that I think that the way that his critique of Dr. King in public that there was a more nuanced position, that perhaps his concern, at least in part, based on some of his correspondence to Coretta Scott King, his conversations with her, and some of the things that he would later say in relation to Dr. King, is that perhaps he thought that the simplified version of Dr. King's message might have been a problem for large numbers of African Americans. And so when he called them Uncle Toms and things of that nature, it seemed to play out a little more like good cop, bad cop. That to kind of, he at times would use his position as leverage to actually help Dr. King in some ways. And I'm thinking bombing of the Birmingham church, where he showed up in the area as kind of the threat that if you don't work with Dr. King, then there's always this other group. So I would argue that his idea of King's politics was actually more nuanced than some of the sound bites that we have. But I just wanted to mention that just as a clarification, perhaps.
So Dr. Nadiri, King also used that same leverage, right? So in his letter from Birmingham jail, he says, "I've tried to be a mediator, because you got other folks out here, the Black nationalists out here, who are threatening to do violence, right?" So he uses the same leverage, right? But I would also go ahead.
No, after you.
But I would also say Malcolm X said what he said, and he said it multiple times.
Right.
I think the correspondence that you're talking about with Coretta Scott King occurred after the assassination of Dr. King, right?
Well, no, it was when Malcolm X had mentioned at a point that he didn't mean to undermine Dr. King, but he knew that he wasn't feared in the way that Malcolm X could use people's fear. And I would wonder if, when we say inside voice, outside voice, that a lot of Malcolm X's critique was an outside voice, meaning for a non-Black audience also, knowing that would carry a lot of sway, that it was for a Black audience, but also was in a way of saying, of kind of putting a message out. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is also true that X in 63 and 64 is very different from what happens before that. So, okay, well, those are all great points. And again, I'm kind of working my way through some of these ideas. So I'm glad
I think
to.
Dr. Bahena had his hand
Oh,
up,
okay.
too.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I looked up.
Okay.
Yeah, jump in.
This is my question, actually. The presentation is pretty good, so I had to walk out of another presentation to listen more carefully, and also to kind of make a question, or not. I'm not sure if it is a question though. I'm from Mexico, so it is a culturally Catholic university. I mean, country. And I say culturally because legally, up until 1992, the Catholic Church was not even, or any church was not recognized as legal entity. So things had to be in the name of specific people, not of an entity. And my question is I don't know, maybe we could work together, because it actually what you're presenting shows how religion is appropriated by the individuals to kind of express an idea, to express a national idea, and also to perhaps even to create an enemy. And I would say this because at the turn of the last century, in Latin America, there was a lot of production, cultural production, some of which actually use religious symbolism to portray the United States as the evil, and Latin America is the good, kind of this image of the indigenous person that prays to the Virgin Mary. And the United States, this white man who comes and steals everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
This is kind of extremely religious symbolism, appeals to the Catholic Church symbolism. It is not a national, but it is a regional identity, putting the United States always as the enemy. And of course, the guy represented should be a white man with a gun, stuff like that. So it follows the traditional symbolism. But it's fascinating that somehow this imagery is weaved into ideologies of identity.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. We should talk more.
Yeah, we should.
We definitely should. Okay. Thank you for all of that. Let me go ahead and get back to this. Yeah, let me hide that. Now, let's take a look at the white Christian nationalist tradition. I think, as important as Black nationalism has been as a critique of the American project, of the American national project, I think the real struggle for control has always been between the civic nationalist and the white nationalist position, right? So the struggle for dominance in American history has always been between civil republicanism and white Christian nationalism. But it's too easy to point to the Klan and the many other groups listed on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website as white nationalists. The real problem is how white Christian nationalism has been mainstreamed. And this is where I think Bella's original hypothesis falls short and requires critique and correction. Indeed, folks in my corner of academia have been kicking it around for the last half century to try to work through some of the problems and make it more useful. So my first example of mainstreamed white Christian nationalism is Josiah Strong, a Midwesterner and a Congregationalist clergyman who became a nationally known leader in 19th century Protestant missions and a founder of the social gospel movement in the United States. Now, the social gospel movement is usually understood to be sort of a progressive movement. And Strong is one of the founders. In 1885, Strong published an influential book entitled Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis. At the time, he served as the General Secretary of the Evangelical Alliance, a major interdenominational mission organization. Strong wrote the book for the American Home Missionary Society to promote the cause of evangelism and Christianization of the United States, especially the Western states and territories. It would be hard to overstate how very mainstream Strong was in 1885. The introduction to the book was written by Austin Phelps, a former president of Andover Theological Seminary, which was one of the most prestigious seminaries. Well, it was the first freestanding theological seminary in the United States. The penultimate chapter of the book, Our Country, is called The Anglo-Saxon and the World's Future. In that chapter, Strong argued that the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to dominate the world and the United States would be its seat of power. Strong made a classic argument for white Christian nationalism, saying the Anglo-Saxon race is the representative of two great ideas, which are closely related. One, he said, is civil liberty. In modern times, he wrote, the peoples whose love of liberty has won it and whose genius for self-government has preserved it have been Anglo-Saxons. The other great idea was pure spiritual Christianity, and the emphasis is in the original. In an anti-Catholic dig, he wrote, it was the fire of liberty burning in the Saxon heart that flamed up against the absolutism of the Pope. And later he claimed, most of the pure spiritual Christianity in the world is found among Anglo-Saxons and their converts, for this is the great missionary race. He made all sorts of claims about the physical superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, its money-making power, and its genius for colonizing, quote unquote. Ending not only with a vision of manifest destiny for North America, but a vision of global colonization, assimilation, and domination. He did not doubt that the Anglo-Saxon race was, quote, destined to dispossess many weaker races, assimilate others, and mold the remainder until, in a very true and important sense, it has Anglo-Saxonized the world. Anglo-Saxonized mankind, unquote. The only question for him was whether Anglo-Saxon civilization would remain true to Christianity or become atheistic and materialistic, and it was up to his audience of white Protestants to make sure it was the former and not the latter. My second example of mainstreamed white Christian nationalism is a 20th century figure, someone I've written about quite a bit, William David Upshaw, a Georgia Baptist lay evangelist and politician who served in the United States Congress from 1919 to 1927. After the First World War, when Upshaw began his political career, the nation began its emergence as a global power. The demographic shifts that have slowly but surely eroded the cultural hegemony of white Protestants over the last century had only just begun, but many white Protestants were already fearful that immigration would change the face of the nation and the faith of the nation. Upshaw believed the nation's strength depended upon maintaining white Protestant social control. Upshaw also believed that the United States had a, quote, mission to humanity, unquote, to lead the world in the establishment of a Christian civilization of righteousness and peace. He believed in America's divinely appointed global leadership for the good of humanity and the glory of God. For Upshaw, America's role in the First World War was a blood sacrifice modeled after Christ's death on the cross. The cause of American democracy and the cause of Christ were intertwined and interrelated. Upshaw used the patriotic surge after World War I to advocate aggressively for the federal government to embrace the lost cause of the Confederacy. He wanted to put the names of Confederate generals on the Arlington Amphitheater when it was built. White Southern loyalty was one of the most frequent themes in Upshaw's congressional speeches. The Confederate rebellion was not treason, he said. It was, quote, the sacrificial act of the hero patriot who intelligently espouses a sacred principle and walks out into the open, offering his blood, if necessary, for the vindication and coronation of that principle before the eyes of the world, unquote. Moreover, Upshaw portrayed white Southerners who had died in World War I as martyrs to the nation, whose deaths testified to Southern loyalty and the measureless triumph of our Christian civilization. One thing that was remarkable to me as I researched the religion of the lost cause was the invisibility of Black people in the lost cause discourse. They were almost entirely absent, but whenever Black people did appear in the discourse, they were portrayed as loyal and happy under the old regime. My final example is Robert Jeffries, an example of 20th century 20th century white Christian nationalism, 21st century white Christian nationalism, rather. Jeffries is pastor of First Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas, a 13,000 member Southern Baptist congregation. According to Right Wing Watch, last year around the 4th of July, Jeffries devoted 4 episodes of his Pathway to Victory broadcast to nationalist topics. He claimed that America was founded as a Christian nation, that the First Amendment was designed to put all Christian denominations on equal footing, not to make Christianity, quote, subservient to other religions, that secularists and other, quote, infidels, unquote, have perverted the meaning of the Constitution, that politics in the US today is a battle between good and evil. Jeffries has a long history of anti-Roman Catholic and anti-Islamic rhetoric, claiming at various times that both religions are satanic. He is especially prone to hurling public insults at the Prophet Muhammad. In the context of the immigration debate, he has several times remarked that, quote, God is the one who created borders, unquote, and God created the concept of nations. No doubt Jeffries would disavow overt racism, as would almost all white evangelicals, but most of them have never faced their own history of racism and white Christian nationalism. And let me stop there one more time and see if there are questions. Anybody with a question or a comment? Okay, so I'll finish on up, and we will talk at the end. All right, so the major challenge to white Christian nationalism in the 20th century came from the nation's African American churches. The civil rights movement, nurtured and sustained by Black churches, challenged the ideology of white supremacy and attempted to create a more inclusive civic nationalism by dismantling structural racism in government institutions of the United States. The civil rights movement clearly represented civic republicanism. The movement not only achieved some significant legislative victories and sometimes prevailed in the courts, it also stigmatized overt expressions of racism and white supremacy to the extent that all but the most extreme racists were forced to give up racist language and learn to communicate in code and so-called dog whistles. Nevertheless, white Christian nationalism did not disappear. It was only driven underground and hidden. It hid in plain sight in what we have come to call the religious right. Historian Randall Balmer argues that the religious right was not rooted in the anti-abortion cause, as is often assumed, but in the defense of Christian segregation academies, private Christian schools founded mostly by white evangelical churches to circumvent federally mandated school desegregation. Federal courts ruled that such schools could not qualify as tax-exempt organizations, and in 1976 revoked the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, retroactively to 1971. Republican activist Paul Weyrich used the issue to bring white fundamentalists and evangelicals into the religious right coalition. Balmer pointed to the battle to defend racist school admission policies as the moment when white fundamentalists and evangelicals began to see themselves as victims and targets in a culture war. But I would argue that the mythology of the lost cause had already conditioned generations of Southern white evangelicals and fundamentalists to interpret federal intervention as a monstrous injustice against Christian culture. Donald Trump did not create white Christian nationalism, but he courted its constituency and stirred its recent awakening. His defense of all things Confederate provides a relevant example. In the context of a national debate over the last few years about systemic racism, white racial violence, and Black deaths at the hands of law enforcement, Confederate monuments represented the most visible symbols of white Christian nationalism, and dozens were torn down by mobs or removed by authorities, though there are still about 700 across the South. There are also 10 US military bases named for Confederate generals and countless highways, parks, museums, bridges, public schools, cemeteries, and other public memorials across the country, maintained by millions of dollars in annual tax revenues. 7 state flags share notable elements of the Confederacy's national battle flags, although the state legislature of Mississippi recently voted to redesign its flag, the last one to explicitly incorporate the Confederate battle flag in its design. In the name of law and order, Trump consistently rushed to the defense of white Christian nationalists and their lost cause iconography at every opportunity. The Charlottesville rally was perhaps the most notable example until the Capitol insurrection. Trump stoked the fires of white nationalist resentment, defended them as very fine people. He couched those comments in a false moral equivalency to give himself some cover, but he also refused even to consider renaming military bases, and he denounced those who would remove, quote, our beautiful statues and monuments, unquote, for, quote, ripping apart our nation's history and culture. White Christian nationalist involvement in the Capitol insurrection is just the latest evidence in a long chain linking Trump to the recent awakening of white Christian nationalism. While evangelical voters supported him by a margin of 81% in 2016, they supported him by a margin of 75% in 2020. And that's remarkable to me in the context of a global pandemic, a global recession, and the national unrest that the United States was enduring. Even as white fundamentalists and evangelicals grow fewer and grayer, they maintain significant cultural power, and their contributions to the nation's renewed polarization over race and national identity reveal that they stand largely in the white Christian nationalist camp. I'll pause there. Questions? I got one more section, and then we can finish up. So let's share one more time. Okay. So let's talk about Joe Biden and civic republicanism. Biden's inaugural address was a civic Republican attempt at course correction. After the white nationalist rally at Charlottesville in 2017, Biden began speaking frequently about, quote, a struggle for America's soul, unquote. Presidential historian John Meacham claimed in a conversation with the New York Times that Biden was not using that word religiously, but talking about character. I disagree. The entire tenor of Biden's inaugural and the content of his inaugural address shows that when he speaks of America's soul, he is speaking the religious language of civic republicanism, and he is talking about character, the nation's character. Invoking the power of religious language of civic republicanism, Biden used his inaugural address to steer the nation away from white Christian nationalism, to reaffirm our national commitment to democracy and his commitment to make our democracy more expansive and inclusive, and to issue a call to national unity. Biden challenged the nation to renounce the narrow racism, nativism, and jingoism that uses flag waving as a camouflage. He deplored, quote, a rising political extremism, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat, unquote. Quoting from the Pledge of Allegiance, he affirmed the United States as one nation under God, indivisible. Together, he said, we shall write an American story of hope, not fear. He repeatedly called the people to national unity, invoking some form of the word unity 12 times. Biden asserted that his inauguration represented the triumph of, quote, the cause of democracy, unquote, and he repeatedly invoked individual liberty, equality, and justice as sacred values. He invoked the word democracy 11 times. Biden also drew upon the notions of American greatness and American progress, but in this case, it was not America's economic greatness or scientific technical progress, but the greatness of America's national character and America's progress towards freedom, justice, and equality. He said that the United States is a great nation and a good people in search of a more perfect union, who have come so far, but still have so far to go. He called the fight for justice and equality a constant struggle and a perennial battle. We must press forward, he said, with speed and urgency, for we have much to do in this winter of peril and possibility, unquote. He cited evidence of moral progress, noting the 20th century victories of the women's suffrage and civil rights movements, which made possible the election of the first woman of color, Kamala Harris, as his vice president. He remarked, quote, we look ahead in our uniquely American way, restless, bold, optimistic, and set our sights on the nation we know we can be and we must be, unquote. Biden's speech was full of religious language and explicit references or allusions to biblical or Christian symbolism. Time permits me only a few examples. He referred to the Capitol as hallowed and sacred ground, and to the presidential oath of office as a sacred oath. He spoke of restoring the soul of the nation and how his whole soul was dedicated to the task. He invited the American people to, quote, open their souls, unquote, rather than, quote, harden their hearts, unquote. The conclusion of the address is perhaps the clearest example of all, as Biden called the American people to dedicate themselves to the cause of the nation. He quoted from the song American Anthem, quote, the work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What will our children say? Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. Then he said, quote, with purpose and resolve, we turn to the tasks of our time. sustained by faith, driven by conviction, and devoted to one another and to this country we love with all our hearts. May God bless America, and may God protect our troops. Thank you, America." Unquote. Faith, conviction, devotion, and the blessing and protection of God. These are classic expressions of the religion of civic republicanism. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Oh, thank you, Mario. Anybody got a question or comment? Mario, go ahead. Can't hear you. It's very, very low.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Correct me if my assumption is wrong. During the 19th century, pseudo scientific racial articulations, I should say, that's when the concept of Latino came into being in French. The concept of we are us being Latin versus the Anglo-Saxon.
Mario, I'm sorry, Mario. I'm having a really hard time. You're very muffled for some reason. I'm having a really hard time.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the journey.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else with a comment or a question? Do you think is there something here or is there nothing here?
I would definitely say there's something here.
I'm kind of giving Mario some time. Is there somebody else wants to ask a question or make a comment?
This is Adelheid. I want to concur with Matt. It's definitely very fascinating. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I came in late, so I can't comment too much, but I very much enjoyed the readings, and I'm looking forward to going back to the recording to see the beginning. So I'll let you know where I get after that.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, you're much clearer now, Mario. Thank you.
Okay, this is the question. It had to do with 19th century, say, pseudo-scientific concepts of the race. That's when kind of a lot of the element of the race that we have right now came into being.
Yes.
One of them, and of course, the Anglo-Saxon started way before. Oh, te ves, Paloma. Te veo, okay. Te sigues viendo, Paloma. My question is this: do you think the Catholics, especially Irish and Southern Italians or Italians, became white because they were not considered white back in the beginning of the early 19th century, became white as America became more tolerant toward Catholics? Does that make sense? So basically the whiteification of Southern Italians, especially Sicilians had the hardest time. And the Irish was accompanied by the American kind of normalizations of the Catholic presence in the United States, because you failed to mention that Biden is Catholic, you know. Now we don't have that problem.
No, it's that you're onto something significant. I mean, Biden is exactly the second Roman Catholic U.S. president. at his inaugural, there was a Catholic priest and an African Methodist Episcopal pastor. So it was the first inauguration in, I think, 40 years without a white Protestant minister at the inauguration. So yeah, and so the question is, how did these, you know, these Catholic Eastern and Southern European immigrants become white? Because you're right, they were not considered white in the early 19th century, especially, right? So the nativist movement, the whole nativist movement in America is about resisting these people who are coming in as Roman Catholic immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So I would say it's, you know, and I'm far from an expert on this particular issue, but I would say my reading of things is that it's a combination of things, right? It's a combination of the growth of Roman Catholicism through the 19th and early 20th centuries in America, and just the sheer numbers, the sheer population, and also the cultural assimilation that takes place as you know, these immigrants who come in, especially after the first generation, you know, and the second and third generations, begin to Americanize, right? Whatever exactly that means for them. So I think that combination of things, you know, works towards this. Because when I was doing my dissertation, and I wrote on a late 19th, early 20th century social reformer and Christian missionary advocate in Rochester, New York, named Helen Barrett Montgomery. And I was researching her in Rochester, New York. And there were all of these, you know, really blatantly sort of racist and anti-immigrant headlines in the Rochester newspapers about Italians with knives, you know, the violence and you know, all of that. And over time, you know, all that goes away, and a Roman Catholic priest becomes a member of the school board in Rochester, New York, and you know, that was a controversial thing. So yeah, it's a process, and it's a process that's been repeated a number of different times, I think, in American history.
Just to jump in, considering that I am third generation Italian American, and you're talking about the cultural assimilation.
Yeah.
I saw this happening from my great grandparents who came over from Italy, and how the assimilation to the American way, the losing of culture, and I don't know if you want to say ethnic background or however, still rooted in Catholicism, but also now there is an interesting break that is happening in Italian American households and their acceptance and or rejection of Christopher Columbus to be able to, I don't want to say claim that cultural assimilation or whiteness or eliminate the ethnicity, right, of the atrocities that he put on people. So there's an interesting thing that's happening in just that cultural sense, right? But we constantly go back to one thing that connects us is our religion, right? So this is that battle that you're kind of talking about, the civic and then ethnic and religious connections. But it's interesting to see and actually experience it through the generations. And it's difficult to navigate. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I agree. It has, you know, it's a process, and I'm sure it has been difficult to navigate. I was thinking, you know, I lived in New England for 17 years, near Fall River, Massachusetts, and also in Providence, Rhode Island, where there are large Portuguese communities. And a similar discourse is going on among the white Portuguese about Philip the Navigator and his legacy, right? Anybody else with a question or comment? Henry Ford, Henry Ford employed loads of immigrants in his automobile industry in Detroit. But he was a huge, racist, anti-Semite, all of that. And, but he had a sociological department in Ford Motor Company that focused on cultural assimilation, right? They purposefully, came up with ways to do that. And I can't remember now what the publication was, but several years ago, I was reading about Henry Ford and some of the things that he did and that the Ford Motor Company did in regard to immigrants. And I read about this. They had some kind of holiday, and they had all the workers out on the grounds of the factory, and they were doing like a festival, a celebration, and they had this play, and on the stage they portrayed immigrants coming into the country in their native costumes and coming into America, and then they crossed the stage and went behind this curtain and came out on the other side, all in their sort of American automotive worker coveralls and uniforms, symbolizing the cultural assimilation process that they had been through. And they were celebrating, that process. And so it was kind of a weird ritual to say, you're American now, right? Whatever you were before, you're no longer that, you're American now.
I'll add an example from my own family, most of whom come from Eastern Europe. I had a great uncle who was the first person on either side of my family to go past college and got his PhD very early on. And when he wanted to enter into academia in the mid 20th century, he actually changed our name. So the last three letters of my name, CIC, he thought that wasn't going to fly. So he changed it to SEN. So his name was Dr. Anthony McClawson. And I always thought that was such a strange thing to change it. If you were going to change it, you could have changed it to something that would have worked. It's like he moved it slightly from sort of Southern Eastern Europe to Scandinavia or something along those lines. But, he was very much about hiding that kind of background, that Catholic background, and where he was coming from. And it was always confusing to me what move he was trying to make there. But he felt that was a necessity to be successful in academia.
Another, talking about becoming American, that's one line of thought that I have encountered many times. The last one was about an anti-Latino article that talked about, when my great-grandparents came back in blah, 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 my great-grandfather sat on the table and said, from now on, we're going to speak English. And of course, the descendant was now talking how newly arrived immigrants are keeping their language, and now we're having kind of these schools that literally just keep the language, Spanish, and we teach it. And of course, this line of thought doesn't include there were also a lot of other immigrants that never sat down and never decided to speak English. They kept their own language. Speaking, and that's why one of the reasons why even in Indiana, although there is no high school for German, every year there is at least 30 students that go to Germany to study abroad in German, because of the descendants of their German descendants kept the language alive in their local communities. So not every, so basically, I guess what I'm saying is that the image what America is, right? What it is to be American in 2021, what is to be American in Henry Ford's times, it's always this slippery image that never quite gets to a specific image. Even if they do cite a specificity, that specificity is only locally, so localized that it doesn't reflect what happens in this vast land that is so different and so complex, and so with different cultures that is extremely, it's always, but there's always this image the America. I guess because I studied nationalism and nations, and I know every image of the nation is always an empty signifier. You had to fill it out with something. You always have to appeal to something, but that quite something is never quite there.
Yeah. Yeah, I originally started to call this presentation, borrowing the title of Bernard Anderson's book on nationalism, Imagined Communities. That was
exactly.
Was where I started out with the title of this presentation, and eventually ended up with Religion Repurposed. But I think that that concept that Bernard Anderson articulates with that term, imagined communities, can fit more than just nationalism. I think it can fit religion is a type of an imagined community. Racial categories are imagined communities, and I think also I gave you. I gave you the reading from Kendi, right? The little, just the introductory chapter, the prologue maybe in the introduction to Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, where he talks about how racist ideas developed, not because there was these hateful people who came up with the idea, but that some policy decisions were made, right? And then in order to rationalize the policy, in order to defend the policy, the idea of white supremacy was useful to defend the policy. Well, that's usually, what I've noticed is that that's how nationalism, that's how the idea of the nation emerged, right?
Yep.
In England, there was this in the time of Henry VIII, he sort of cleared out the old nobility. He wanted to consolidate his power, so he either exiled or murdered a bunch of the nobility, and he took over church lands and everything, and so he needed new people to fill his bureaucracy. And so a bunch of young men who were university educated, but who were from the minor gentry, they weren't of the pure blood, right? But he brought them into his government as long as they were loyal. And in order to explain their status, they began to articulate this idea that they were representative of the people. This idea of the people as an elite began to emerge as a political elite. And so it was in order to in order to explain the new policy, the idea comes into being. And so in a lot of cases, these imagined communities of race or of religion or of like political entities like nations, something happens, something historically contingent happens to bring them into being, and then they have to be rationalized, and that's where these ideas come from.
I certainly agree with you, and I'm glad that you're reading Benedict Anderson, because he's the first great author that basically puts Latin America on the forefront of nationalism. Before that, everybody thought, in Latin America, we just copy everything from Europe. But no, you actually created nations where there wasn't any. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And Europe actually follow your lead. And I would agree with you that race is also an imagined community, because you never know where the lines are, or the lines are always kind of flexible. That's one of the great quotes that I use from Anderson is there's the borders are elastic, because there's always somebody new, somebody kind of, they're constantly being redrawn. Somebody else is always coming into the nation. And I'm seeing right now in the United States, we're seeing how Latinos are becoming white. little by little. Now in the census, we had to say we're white because I cannot say that I'm Pacific Islander. So I had to, we actually, more and more, we're just being labeled as white. And although we're considered to be racially different, in the future, I'm quite sure we're just going to be part of the white, just like the Southern Europeans, the Armenians are white, the Turkish are white, you know, people that, of course, the founding fathers would never have considered to be white. But it's part of what is a race, you know, it's an imagined community whose borders are not quite fixed.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Anybody else with a comment? Well, I just want to say thanks everybody for listening. And you know, I really appreciate the opportunity to try out my thinking. Would love, you know, if you have further ideas or critiques or feedback, I would love to hear from you about it and to continue the conversation. Trying to figure out if I want to try to publish something, write something about this stuff, and you know, do some publishing around this idea. But you know, I basically just had a burr in my saddle. I couldn't after January 6th, and I saw what was going on, I just had to find a way to talk about it. So thanks for letting me get it off my chest.